Within each of these long-running franchises, there is the dark horse. There always seems to be a closet hidden away in the timelines filled with games that the series kind of forgot about for a whole bunch of reasons. The most common reason being that they were kind of cheaply made handheld games and therefore never was able to capture the attention of the audience due to the money issues and the budget problems. Like I've said before, I've usually had good luck with these forgotten games. Assassin's Creed Bloodlines was a really badly made game with little to offer, but it was also freaking hilarious since it was held to less content restrictions from those jerkwads at Ubisoft. Metal Gear Ghost Bobble was probably the best 2D adaptation of Metal Gear Solid ever made, and Metal Gear Acid, through its creative use of the PSP's limitations, managed to make one of my favorite games of that series. That brings us to today with Resident Evil Gaiden, a game I have heard literally no one talk about ever, which is weird since you'll usually get a glimpse or two of the aforementioned games through fan conversation or references within the franchise itself, but I have not heard one peep come from Gaiden. So with interest already in full swing, let's crack on and see what the Game Boy Color can bring to the Resident Evil stage of things. Surprisingly, Gaiden brings several revelations to the table for a project that you would assume from the start to be something made cheap, quick, and shit. First of all, the game is the third appearance of Barry Burton in a protagonist role, and once again he does an awesome job at it. Love to see you again, Barry, kicking ass alongside Leon Kennedy. Second, one of the main characters in the game dies, which opens up ramifications for the rest of the series. Third, is the first Resident Evil game to take place on a cruise liner. And fourth, the game technically has first-person combat. So yeah, did not expect this to happen at all. Pretty much, it's like Ghost Bobble. Gaiden is pretty much the closest adaptation of Resident Evil you are going to get in a 2D space. It pretty much has all the baseline staples of the original game. Unique, interesting location that unlocks over time, the whole backtracking system and picking up obscure items and ferrying them between puzzles to figure out what happened to the ship, where all the zombies came from, and generally unmasking the villain behind everything. Unfortunately, this game actually doesn't have an Albert Wesker, so it obviously isn't going to be as good as Resident Evil, but I think it did a better job at what the project was aiming for than IGN giving it a paltry 4 out of 10. That's just uncalled for. The game begins by Barry being pulled out of active service on the mainland by his STARS handlers and gets told to help out an already existing operation to figure out what the hell is wrong with this cruise liner that went dark. Leon Kennedy has already been sent to it either in his job that he had before he was a cop, or the government sent him in because he has prior experience in zombie bullshit. I'm not sure if this game starts before or after Resident Evil 2, but it's one of those things. Immediately when Barry steps onto the ship, he gets into contact with the new zombie residents on this luxury liner, and has to figure out where Leon is, and that objective begins Barry's next hour or two of screwing around and hoping for the best. One of the things handed to him in order to bewilder him more on this confusing journey is the game's combat system. When the combat isn't totally screwed up, since my emulator apparently couldn't handle a game of this magnitude and visual artifacting started appearing everywhere, let's just say that M4, the team behind Gaiden, took a stab at doing something innovative and kinda missed the mark on that. The first-person combat is a mess for a bunch of reasons. One being that there isn't a reliable guarding system, so if you end up in a bad spot with a bunch of zombies, well, that's just too freaking bad. The aiming is also pretty pants, since the way the game substitutes actual aiming with the analog version is to have a constantly moving reticle set in a bar where you have to click the attack button on a zombie's bar to hit them, and this would be fine, but some of the game's more useful weapons like the rifle and the rocket launcher speed up the reticle to ridiculous speeds, like the last block of the Toad in the Box minigame in Mario Party 2. I'll toss up a clip of that minigame just to show the people who don't know what I'm talking about, so that means that in the late game, Your reliable weapons can't do enough damage to kill late game enemies, and the weapons that can are barely reliable to function, so it becomes a mess, even with how M4 tried to emulate Resident Evil's combat onto a handheld device, with the zombies constantly walking forward, chomping down on you, needing to be defended against, and the repertoire of weapons not having FPS reliability. But they scaled it down way too far. Plus, the game has nothing to give you for a reliable all-else-fails weapon. Something with infinite ammo that doesn't do a lot of damage that you can fall back on when you run out of bullets. The game gives you the knife, which is a terrible idea since the knife requires you to get into close range, has shit damage, and since you're so close to everything you're fighting, you're inevitably running down your health since it seems like the zombies attack on a guaranteed timer the more you stand next to them. Plus, hidden items like in Resident Evil 2 make this worse since you end up having extremely valuable ammunition hidden in walls and crooks in the game that have no indication that there's something like grenade launcher or rocket ammunition hiding in these corners. Another annoyance is that since the game is 2D, nothing really creative was done with Gaiden to try and simulate 3D space, so walking around zombies is not going to happen because the hitboxes and sprite interactions make no sense other than the game being in 2D land. It's not impossible to deal with, it's just that you have to change your approach. Don't try to get close to any zombie if you don't want to fight them, because you will collide with their sprite and be forced into battles, and you need to remember that any decoration whatsoever will be a solid object, making almost the entire game a lot of tight corridors. It just takes a bit more thinking time, which is great since Gaiden's zombies have to be some of the slowest that Capcom has ever licensed or made themselves. So, after getting you somewhat handled on the combat, the game starts with Barry needing to find where Leon ended up through the first available rooms, and when he finally does start running across puzzles, it is a sad day to see that Gaiden falls back exclusively on key hunting puzzles, and none of the wacky logic puzzles from the main game. I know it would have been super difficult to do that sort of thing with the Game Boy Color, but I would have liked to see M4 put in the effort and try to do some actual puzzle gameplay within all the key hunts, but unfortunately that is all we're really getting. You keep finding weird inventory stuff around the ship, and you eventually have to put all the stuff in all of its places in order to progress through the game. Kinda disappointing, but it's pretty standard, so here we are. So after the first hour or two of screwing around, fighting zombies over and over again, and finally getting onto the top deck of the ship, Barry does finally get somewhere and finds a survivor, Lucia, on the top deck. Lucia is par for the course for Capcom, an odd character to say the least, as we'll discuss later, but for now, Lucia at the very least did have contact with Leon, and can help inform Barry about the situation the pair are facing. It takes a little while of going through other people's things, and finally seeing the B.O.W. that Barry was sent on the mission for, before we finally figure out where Leon ended up. But the last two boss fights we had with the monster did finally reveal something. Lucia seems to have some sort of connection with the monster, as she had warned Barry about it before she had the chance to ever see it come in the room. It makes sense that with the special ability she has to commune with the Umbrella B.O.Ws, that she would be an outcast and therefore give her a better chance of surviving the disaster due to being alone all the time, but for now, Barry has to worry about her more since the B.O.W. has the ability to change between a solid and a liquid form, a la Terminator, and use that ability to kidnap Lucia and escape, Barry leaving him alone for a good 5 minutes before finding Leon had somehow managed to get himself trapped on a lower deck of the ship. Thank Christ it's a ship, and therefore rope was literally all over the place. Now that safety had been established somewhat for the moment, Leon and Barry can start rifling through the facility rooms on the ship to find information now that Lucia's strange ability has made the pair suspicious, and even beyond that, being the only survivor of the disaster, they have to save her from the monster because of generic protagonist. It takes a little bit of doing, obviously, going through some more cabins, activating the security system, and taking a piss in the ladies' room, but they do finally find Lucia again, in the hands of the monster on an upper deck, meaning more fighting with this guy. We've gone through this 3 times already, so it's getting kinda repetitive, dude. This objective has finally come full circle, and now everyone is safe. They can regroup and figure out how to deal with the monster. Right after they deal with this miraculous fire that started spreading down on the lower decks. Because reasons, Barry decides that splitting up is the best way to deal with this tragedy, with him staying on the upper decks and getting communications running again, while Leon is left with Lucia to finagle the sprinkler system to take care of the fire. Unsurprisingly for Resident Evil destroying its own facilities, this isn't an easy task, since it requires the fire extinguisher. A totally necessary roundabout path to get at the systems, and yet another fight with a goddamn monster, probably. But once everything has finally gotten under control again, maybe the pair can finally take a breath, and no, that didn't happen. This time, Barry decides to pull a gun on Leon in order to take Lucia under his own care, while Leon goes and doesn't end up getting shot from them. You might have noticed this throughout the video, but one thing I did like about this budget production was that the people writing for it too threw a bunch of effort at it, and at the very least tried to put some accents, interesting bits, and inflections into the dialogue in order to try and make this a bit better than the usual average thing, where it's just, you have to go here and put the thing in the thing script, which I just really enjoyed. It varied up the running around exploration quite a bit and actually made cutscenes something to look forward to. But before Leon can collect himself from this new altercation, another random unexpected thing occurs, and now the Starlight has suffered a huge explosion. Leon is once again on maintenance duty that has become more important than the fate of Lucia, so he rushes down to the engine room, and I think at this point is going to be a good time to mention this. The backtracking in Gaiden pretty much sucks across the board. I know that backtracking in video games in general gets a bad rap because it's boring and stupid, seeing things you already did and just generally repeating things. But a lot of games have figured out how to do backtracking right, and that's to cut it out entirely, like God of War did, or to make more interconnected maps like the original Resident Evil. Gaiden, on the other hand, has very few branching paths and shortcuts, which makes navigation a huge hassle due to the traditionally resurrecting zombies, and ultimately very boring since it takes quite a while to reach old rooms, and you do backtracking quite a few times, meaning that a lot of the bottom level corridors you'll be seeing quite a bit, maybe like 5 times overall. The introduction of shortcut elevators doesn't help all that much, since they barely hit any rooms and fail to expedite trips. By the end of the game, I was rolling my eyes at seeing the first floor West Wing corridor and all the holes in that hallway for like the 7th time in the game. But you get down to the boiler room as Leon and have an even worse day, since you find the monster for the 5th time and have to fight it again, only to barely get out of there with any usable ammunition, and the entire ship is completely fucked. That explosion totally ruined the engine and is now flooding the ship, and Leon is sort of succumbing to his wounds, so I'm going to assume he's at this point where his life is just flashing before his eyes, and he might be accepting of his own death. But since Leon's story is kinda getting boring, M4 wisely transitions back to the what the hell portion of Barry's story now that he's negotiating with the Umbrella sub-captain that he was offering Lucia to, but in a classic Resident Evil move, Barry double-crosses the double-cross and ends up holding Lucia hostage for information from this Umbrella guy. This finally ends the objective of figuring out what the hell happened to the cruise liner, and its main mission was to retrieve Lucia, so they sent the B.O.W to get her. It's because Lucia was infected with the T-virus and was harboring another parasitic B.O.W in her body, that would burst out and kill her in 10 days. Now Barry's using his leverage to demand that the parasite get removed immediately, saving Lucia, and miraculously, the captain agrees to this and the surgery was a huge success. All is well and good for once. For about 5 seconds, whereupon the parasite escapes containment and latches onto the captain, killing him immediately and infecting him with the T-virus while the parasite goes and grows to full term outside of a body. It's Umbrella, those things kinda tend to happen. Barry quickly deals with the zombie captain and somehow manages to gain control of the entire ship in a matter of minutes. His plan to fool Umbrella for the submarine trip was completely successful. Now all the pair needs now is to recapture Leon. The ship's sinking, so I'm guessing that Barry is going to let nature do the work and kill the monster all on its own while they escape with the sub. That was the whole plan anyway. The pair get down to the engine room pretty quickly since the zombies that are left behind have been killed so many times that it's become routine at this point, and they do find Leon. He's actually kind of fine after that battle and the explosions and the whole nope. The monster reveals its shape-shifteriness and decides to hide as Leon for a whole minute before transforming back to normal and fighting Barry anyway, because that made a ton of sense. Hey, Monsterface, why not just become Leon and they would have escorted you to safety right away instead of fighting and beating you back into a puddle just to pick up regular Leon, who's kind of at the acceptance of his own death stage before Barry slaps him out of it and all three limp him back to the sub. But if you know your Resident Evils, there's one thing left to do, so of course, the final boss shows up literally at the door, between the player and the ending of the game, and not in the way you would actually expect. Since the monster's objective is Lucia, it shows up and drags her down into the sea with it to drag her back to Umbrella, which would have happened had Barry not jumped in for her and miraculously saved her life from the monster in the water. But somehow he reached the starlight with 2 Lucias. Gasp! The sitcom cliche has come to life! Due to Lucia having earlier received the parasite appendectomy, she had also lost her sensing ability for the monster. And so the classic goof starts playing out for a little bit, before the real Lucia gets the brilliant idea and cuts herself with a knife she had access to in order to reveal that she had red blood. The monster canonically had green blood from all the times the pair have been shooting it throughout the starlight. The monster is revealed and transforms into the final boss, which is no joke. Basically, at this point in the game, I was bleeding ammunition through as fast as possible, because like I said earlier, strong weapons are not reliable due to the reticle speeding across the screen Tasmanian Devil style, and the limitation that M4 put on it with all the hidden ammo all over the place. I think I actually reloaded an old save before the boiler room monster fight just to pick up grenades and rockets before heading back down and settling things because I needed that ammunition for the later fights. The combat is just not fun, and making the prospect of taking damage inevitable ruins it even more. But stick with it and you'll have managed to save all 3 characters and finish one heck of a quirky Capcom licensed handheld game. Thinking back on this game while I was writing this, I remember liking it a bit more than people might think I would, since even though it had a lot of limitations on the Game Boy Color, M4 at least took a proper swing at getting this project functioning, fun, and translated over from the PlayStation. Yeah, there's a whole lot that you could pick apart about this game, even with the at the times argument helping it out, because overall the game was too ambitious for its own good, and didn't exactly connect the power of the handheld to the Resident Evil concept to the best that it could have been with all the game that had missing, but what the game had I felt was actually pretty solid. The gameplay is a mess and gets tiring pretty fast with the inevitability of taking damage, the wonky as hell first person shooter idea, the infinite enemies and limited bullets all adding up to be a bit of a mess, but the story writing is solid. The game has decent characters and the portrayals of Barry and Leon were fun to see again in that visual novel style of cutscenes, but even though we finally got everyone on the boat and back to safety, Gaiden isn't done fucking with you, and the final scene that plays is exactly why Gaiden is officially non-canon. kicked out on its ass like Snake's revenge. The trio sail away on the sub, but the close-up on the character shows that Leon was bleeding green blood. Yep, the first B.O.W. managed to survive the encounter with Leon in the boiler room, having also killed him, and I know what you're saying there. Okay, so Leon in the boiler room you see first was the monster, but the Leon you find slumped over the corner and save was also the other monster. But then later on you have the monster also drag down Lucia into the sea, which transforms into the final boss. And the answer to that is yes, it works, because at that point, the parasite had evolved into a B.O.W. in the space of like a whole minute, and it escaped while Barry was dealing with the zombie captain. So, the pair of monsters had a reasonable amount of time to set up the ruse for one of them to escape, which is why I'm wondering if the B.O.Ws were so intelligent to do all this stuff in the first place. Why didn't they just stick with the Leon rescued is a shapeshifter trick, because this seems way more complicated to achieve the exact same thing. But yeah, in this timeline, Leon Kennedy was killed by a B.O.W, and the one that took his place was also probably killed as the second boss in an unreleased game once he reached shore and started doing some weird shit. At least Lucia gets to live on with Barry's family. Maybe Lucia grew up to be that sister that Moira shot in Revelations 2 in the cheekiest of references. That would have been fun at least. So yeah, for what you would expect, Gaiden is a lot more enjoyable of a game than you would expect, with the developers trying to put together at least a typical Resi plot with the twist that entails, while the gameplay suffers from the concept being too ahead of the Game Boy Color's capability. If you are a fan of Resident Evil, I would say definitely check it out, since what it does is something that only it can manage. It is a unique experience. But to general audiences, I would say skip it. You are definitely not missing out on something world-changing by not seeing Gaiden. I still think 4 out of 10 is completely ludicrous for a score of this game's magnitude, as you can see by this scoreboard we're putting up now. I'll leave you guys with a final victory for gamers, and thank you once again for coming with me on yet another voyage of the SS Quirky.